So we've already talked about levels of analysis. I want to talk about some other broad kind of theories or models that guide applying psychology to business environments. And one of probably the biggest kind of overarching models is the idea of theory X versus theory Y. And of course, Theory X wasn't called Theory X until Theory Y came out, and there was no single theory that defined Theory X, nor is there any single theory that defends Theory Y. But if you start looking at the history of applying psychology or just behavior in general to organizations, you'll find that a lot of theories break into one of these two groups. Douglas McGregor here in the picture, 1906 to 1964, was one of the big proponents of kind of classifying information into these two ways. And initially, it was presented that theory Y was superior to theory X, that theory X was a good place to start, but it was replaced with theory Y. I would actually make an argument to some degree that there is still some jobs and some roles that theory X may be a better theory to work from. So in Theory X, the basic standpoint is that if you don't constantly watch over, push, motivate, and punish your workforce, nothing will get done. In other words, Theory X is a strong believer in managerial control, that the basic worker is lazy, the basic worker does not want to be there, the basic worker is not motivated, and therefore, if you're going to get productivity out of them, you have to motivate them. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to punish them, but it does mean that you have to watch over, monitor, and push them to get things done. It's a very active managerial style. Theory Y basically suggests that this is all wrong and that what managers or bosses should do is trust their employees and create an environment where the job itself or the organization or the environment provides the motivation and provides them the push. So it generally believes that if you give the proper motivation and incentives, people can and will choose to do the job. So if we kind of think about this, Theory X probably applies more to if you have a workforce that is simply there for the money and you're not providing enough money, you're probably going to have to push, motivate, and monitor to get work out of that group. Theory Y would suggest that if you have a workforce, as long as you provide them with the proper motivation, the proper encouragement, and the proper incentives, in this case, pay them enough, that they'll be naturally wanting to do their jobs. Now, obviously, in both these settings, you can have someone that is highly internally motivated in a Theory X situation who will still perform whether you motivate them, watch them, or push them or not. They just have, quote unquote, a great work ethic. Likewise, you can have a perfect Theory Y situation where all of the job itself and the incentives would encourage most people to work, and you have someone that's like, if you're going to pay me to do nothing and you're not watching me, guess what? I'm going to do nothing. So there is no black and white situation here where all workforces are Theory X, all workforces are Theory Y. But it is a reminder that if we try to apply Theory X as a stamp to all jobs, a lot of times we are going to get suboptimal results, that a lot of work and a lot of jobs are probably better managed by Theory Y. And if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's the pyramid of 5 levels, and the start is just that basic need. Theory X kind of applies if you're not providing those basic needs, you're probably going to have to monitor and push to get people to do the job that you want them to. Theory Y suggests that if you've supplied the basic needs, then people will start to self-actualize and want to work well because they're given an environment to do so. And you can kind of think about your own attitudes towards work. Are you more of a Theory X worker? You're just there to trade your time for dollars, and if the management does not make sure you're doing your job, you see no reason to do it. Some of us are like that. Or are you more a Theory Y worker? Are you someone who, as long as you're being paid an equitable amount, enough to make your basic needs, whatever those are, be met, you're likely to work? I tend to be Theory Y. I don't feel very comfortable not doing good work and not putting time in. I'm currently recording this lecture kind of off time because I want to get it done. I want to make sure I've done a good job on it. So I am being paid to do that, but I'm not being watched. I'm not being monitored or pushed. I'm doing it because, in my opinion, the university is paying me a fair and equitable rate. They're giving me support, and my job is to provide these lectures. Therefore, that's what I'm going to do. So if we look at kind of organizational effectiveness and breaking down theory X versus theory Y, if we look at the orientation towards people, theory X is distrusting. They assume that people are going to cheat and are going to be lazy. Theory Y assumes people are going to be accepting and promotes betterment of human resources. So again, theory Y is going to be a more trusting theory, but that is not always going to be the right theory or the right viewpoint depending on the job and the workforce. The assumptions about people. Again, theory X, basically lazy. Theory Y, the need to achieve maybe and be responsible. In other words, theory Y assumes that people want to achieve, they want to be responsible. You just need to provide them the situation to allow them to do that. And for many workers, this is true. Interest in working. Theory X is there's low interest in working, almost a disinterest in working. The only reason the person's there is for the paycheck. While theory Y assumes that there's a high, very interest in work. People want to work. People want to feel attached to their jobs, engaged with their jobs. And finally, conditions under which people will work hard. Again, theory X, work when pushed, work when observed, work when punished. Theory Y, work when appropriately trained and recognized, but not necessarily micromanaged. And again, you can probably think through your own experiences of some jobs that honestly theory X is probably more appropriate, and many jobs where theory Y is more appropriate. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of let you in on a quiet secret in the field of applying psychology to the workplace. It's not cheap. Generally speaking, consulting and bringing in people with PhDs and experience in industrial organizational psychology into your organization requires some actual devotion to addressing these concerns, and it's often a concern for organizations that are larger and have more money. Therefore, a lot of the theories we're going to talk about are going to be theory Y. They're going to be focused on jobs where people are going into those fields because they feel a drawing to that field. They want to use their skills. They want to be responsible. They are interested in working, and they're being compensated fairly for that work. That's where theory Y very much works, and that's why a lot of the theories we're going to talk about in this class are theory Y. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of jobs, a lot of smaller companies, a lot of companies that can't afford psychologists that come in that may be operating under theory X. I often refer to theory X companies as ones that will treat employees as kind of churn and burn. And probably all of you have had some experience working at basically a low or minimum wage paying job where the general attitude is it really isn't that expensive to replace people. We bring them in, we use them as much as we can, we use the theory X approach, and when they're done working, they leave and we replace them. That's kind of a churn and burn. The problem with that is you're not necessarily getting engaged workers. You're not necessarily getting people that are loyal to the company using that kind of a model. But we do want to always apply the it depends kind of viewpoint on which theories we're applying. And I think when I'm actually consulting, this is one of the first questions I often ask myself, maybe not in these terms, but I will think, is this a theory X job or is this a theory Y job? And am I trying to suggest a theory Y solution to a theory X problem? And likewise, am I trying to apply a theory X solution to a theory Y problem? It's a way to just kind of conceptualize that there are differences in jobs, there's differences in organizations, and there's differences in individuals. And we need to consider all of those when we're thinking about ways to make the workplace better. So is one way always better than the other? You probably already figured this out from my previous discussions that both of these have pros and cons. One theory may apply well in one situation, but not another. And again, you can probably think of examples. Generally speaking, I often think of this as another way to think about this potentially is white collar versus blue collar. And those are broad terms and they don't necessarily capture all types of work. But again, we want to ask how invested is the person in the career and their skill set? If the answer is that they're not invested, in other words, they're not proud of what they do, they're not proud of the skills they use, or there's not many skills that someone needs to do the job, that job by its very nature may be more successfully impacted by theory X kind of interventions. However, if the person is very much aware of their skill set, proud of what they do, if you ask someone, what do you do? If their first answer is to tell you, I'm an engineer, I'm a college professor, I'm a firefighter. I'm a police officer. Those were the examples of there's some pride in that work, and there's probably a set of skills that had to be learned to be good at that work. So again, we want to think about that, but we also then want to ask, does our managers use the theory appropriate to the skill sets? And think of some of your own examples. One of the best ways to engage with this material is to be thinking about your own work experiences and how this would have applied, or maybe even given you an insight into the behaviors of various people in the jobs that you've had so far. So why do we do this stuff? Why does organizational behavior or psychology in business settings matter? The first one is that we know from an enormous amount of research that job satisfaction is a highly predictive measurement. If we ask someone how satisfied are they with their job, how satisfied they are with management, how satisfied they are with pay and benefits, and how satisfied they are with the quality of work, what we generally find is that satisfied employees are more pleasant at work. In other words, everyone else enjoys working with more satisfied employees. They tend to have lower costs. Satisfied employees tend to be more productive, more successful in using their time, and also tend to do less counter work behaviors, less likely to do workplace theft, and also are often less likely to be tardy, late, or even sick. They tend to be higher productivity and they are less likely to quit. So in other words, they retain in their positions longer, they're less likely to leave the organization, they're more likely to be engaged, and they usually have higher levels of productivity. We find the exact opposite when people report being unsatisfied. And that unsatisfaction can come from a number of factors. It can be management, it can be the job itself, and it may even be things outside the organization. I can think of a time when I was a fairly unsatisfied employee that had nothing to do with the organization. It's just my own personal life was kind of in chaos at that time. But when people are unsatisfied, they tend to reject organizational policies more. In other words, they tend to not necessarily follow what they're supposed to be doing. They are more likely to participate in what we often call counterproductive behaviors in the workplace, which is a funky name for stealing from the company. And that theft can be time, that theft can be resources, that theft can be as simple as office supplies. They tend to have a higher turnover rate, so that's more costly for a business. They're more likely to leave. And the more skilled the person is, the more complex the job is, the more it costs to actually train someone else to take that job over. And often there is a negative dip in productivity as you switch from one employee to another. And we also find an increase in mental and physical illness. So unsatisfied employees tend to call in sick more and also tend to have more problems with burnout and emotional stress. So at the individual level, it makes sense for individuals to want to be satisfied, but it also makes sense for the organization itself to be thinking about how do we make sure our employees are, for the most part, a theory Y kind of view. They are supported, they feel happy, and they feel satisfied. So organizational behavior recognizes the dynamic nature of organizations. So there's some fundamental assumptions, and we've already been going over some of them. One was levels of analysis, that one of the ways to look at organizations is at the individual level, the group level, and the organizational level. Another assumption is that most jobs and most interventions will fit in theory X or theory Y. Another one of these assumptions is the dynamic nature of organizations. And what this means is organizations should be viewed as living creatures. And one of the actual models that we use for this is called open systems. That basically organizations are self-sustaining systems that transform inputs from the external environment to outputs, which the system then returns to the environment. So basically, an organization exists in an environment, and that environment can be looked at in many, many ways. It might be cultural, it might be the country or countries it is in, it might be the political systems, it can also be the supply chains. But that is the external. So outside of the environment is any laws that impact the organization. Outside the environment is where the organization finds new employees. Outside the organization is where the organization finds supplies or raw materials. Once these things are brought in the organization, that's what we look at. That's that system of organizational function. And then whatever the organization produces is returned out to the environment where hopefully it is valuable. In other words, outside of the organization again, there are people that are willing to pay for those products or services. So we often want to think about open systems when we're kind of analyzing where there might be problems within an organization. So here's an example of that dynamic nature of the open system model. So the environment itself can be the local community in which the organization is based. And in this example, we actually are using it as an orchestra. So think about an orchestra is an organization. There is a group of people. They are brought together in a structured setting to produce an actual shared objective. So it meets all of our requirements for an organization. So the environment for an organization might be the local community in which the organization is based, and the community of professionals and musicians and conductors that it can draw from. In other words, anyone that joins the organization needs to be in that external environment before they become a part of the organization. And the organization itself is producing something that is hopefully consumed by the local community in which the orchestra exists. The inputs are basically everything that's being brought into the organization. That includes donations, that includes the pool of available musicians, employees, that includes information about the interest of the audience, so market research, that includes the theater and the buildings necessary to actually do the performances, and then the volunteers to help the theater run. The throughputs is actually kind of rehearsing and turning notes on paper into pleasing music. In other words, it's creating programs, it's creating concerts. And then the marketing campaign to attract an audience that is willing to then pay to see this performance. And the output is the actual live musical performance, recordings, performances on CD or digital platforms, the enjoyment of the audience members, musicians' education of the community, and money from those ticket sales. And all of that becomes also a feedback loop. And the feedback loop is how the outputs are received by the environment, which may then impact the inputs. So for example, a particular type of music may be noted as more successful than others. Maybe it's when the orchestra is performing actual soundtracks from modern movies compared to classical pieces. The feedback would then inform, hey, we need more people that are focused on modern interpretations of music because that's what actually does better. It might be reviews from music critics. So generally speaking, when we're looking at the open system model, we're looking at 5 things. We're looking at the environment the organization exists in. We're looking at all of the inputs, what's brought in from that environment to allow the organization to succeed. The throughput, what does the organization actually do? The outputs, what is the actual products or services produced? And the feedback, how does the environment react to those outputs, which then further informs inputs? Now you'll notice this is, again, a dynamic model. It involves change. Organizations that never change typically go out of business at some point. And we can think of many examples recently, within the last 2 or 3 decades, of major companies that did not change with the environment or the needs of the customers, that were caught flat-footed and are no longer in business. One of the couple of the things that jump to my mind, and these are a little bit older because unfortunately most of my examples are fairly old, but I loved the social media platform MySpace. It is now almost gone. It's not even really there anymore. And when Facebook first came out, I really didn't see how Facebook would be an advantage because you could do a lot more on MySpace. But what I missed was that in order to do more on MySpace, you kind of had to know how to do some coding and you had to be a little bit more sophisticated, while Facebook was 100% user friendly. And very quickly, Facebook absolutely replaced MySpace. Another example is I loved my BlackBerry phone. It was one of the first smartphones I ever had. I really enjoyed it. And it was very much designed for business use, not personal use. When the first iPhones came out, they were designed that they could still be used for business, but they were also specifically designed for more personal use. And again, within a year, BlackBerry was gone. These are examples of how systems were not being dynamic, were not adapting to the environment, and that can lead to an organizational decay. So another fundamental assumption is that there is no one best approach, that it's a contingency approach. It's a perspective suggesting that organizational behavior is affected by a large number of interacting factors. How someone will behave is said to be contingent upon numerous variables at once. There is no clear-cut, one-size-fits-all solution. There's just a lot of shades of gray. What this basically means is that human behavior is complex to begin with. If we're trying to determine how one person is going to behave in an organization, we have to, one, recognize that some of the influences on their behavior are beyond the organization's control. It's their own personal life, it's their family life, it's their relationships. All of these are factors that may not directly be approachable by the organization. But the organization still wants to think about how can I control the levers I do have control over, job satisfaction, type of job, type of work, how this person is using their skills, and also management. But all of that's complex as well. So how we're designing the job, how we're rewarding the job's performance, how we're measuring performance, what kind of feedback we're giving, what kind of management, all of those go into how one individual may be behaving within an organization, which means that all of that has to be taken into account. You'll hear me say in these lectures the simple phrase, "it depends," a lot. Because in my opinion, that's one of the most powerful two words in industrial organizational psychology. Never go into trying to fix an organization or provide a solution to a problem based on psychology, assuming that you already know the answer. You really need to go in there and decide, is this the best approach for this situation? A good example of how this happens is actually a go-to solution for a lot of problems when we're applying psychology to organizations is to create what's called high-performing teams. And we'll be talking about groups and teams later in this class. The problem with that is that most of the time it is the right solution, but there are going to be times where it's not. And you need to recognize that contingency approach, really looking at the situation and finding a tailored approach to applying what psychology knows about human behavior to increase both the individual satisfaction, the group performance, and the overall organization success. So we're going to briefly talk about the history of psychology applied to business settings. We're going to talk about scientific management, classic organizational theory, human relations movement, and then kind of prominent trends in the infotech age. And I can break this down to basically kind of these broad themes. Scientific management was the first application of basically thinking about what does science have to tell us about how jobs should be designed. And it was a major revelation. And it pretty much went hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution in the Western world. Classical organizational theory then also started to look at the HR component. So if we look at scientific management, we're really not talking about people. We're talking about designing organizations and jobs. Classical organizational theory starts to think about how do we set up an organization to at least acknowledge the human element or the human resources factor within it. The human relations movement started to move away from these top-down approaches, scientific management and classical organizational theory, and started to ask the question about what about bottom-up? How about the individuals? And that's really been the prominent trends from that point on, is really looking at how do we adjust for the individual. But I should make a quick note that that's because scientific management and classical organizational theory are fairly well set up in almost every large organization at this point. And of course, the infotech age has been changing these, and recent research has been looking into hybrid and virtual work and how to increase the human relations movement within those new settings of technology. So in the early days of applying psychology to the workplace, really what we're talking about here is scientific management, and it's an early approach to management and organizational behavior, emphasizing the importance of designing jobs as efficiently as possible. So this isn't about making people happy. This is a Theory X kind of viewpoint of the world of how do we design a job to where people have no choice but to be proficient. Frederick Taylor was the big name here, and he worked with various industries to improve productivity through simplifying tasks and training workers on one task so they can perform it at an optimal level. A very good example of this was Henry Ford in the Model T. So most auto manufacturers took an enormous amount of time to build a car because they normally had 3 or 4 mechanics that fully knew all the intricacies of building a vehicle. Henry Ford basically took a lot of people that had no idea how to build a car, and he taught each one of them how to do one job, and then he put them in a giant assembly line. One of the ways I like to think about this is that prior to scientific management, if you were a barrel maker, you would have a significant number of skills. You would know how to work wood. You'd know how to pick the right wood, how to cut wood, how to actually shape it. You'd know how to actually make grooves in the wood. You'd know how to do metalworking. You'd know how to make the metal bands. And it might take you 3 or 4 days from start to finish to build one barrel. In the end, you fully owned that process. You'd used your skills. You were a skilled worker. You were a carpenter. You were a metalsmith, and you created a barrel. The problem, though, with this is that it took a lot of time and a lot of skill to design one barrel, which made them expensive. As more and more organizations were wanting to produce greater and greater volumes of perishable goods that were being shipped by barrels, we started to move towards more of a systematic process. Instead of training one person for years in all of the intricacies of barrel making, what if we trained one person to pick out the wood and that's it? So they went and got the wood. One person to cut the initial wood, a third person to actually then take those cuttings and immediately put the grooves in them. Another person would assemble them, and another person would create the metal bands, and maybe even another person would put those metal bands on. If you get that all working well, you're suddenly producing multiple barrels every day with a lot less skilled workers. Now you have more workers, but overall you're paying less money to produce more barrels. And that's the idea behind scientific management. It's really about designing jobs to be as simple as possible, as effective as possible, and as quick as possible. So scientific management results in a massive increase in productivity. The four principles of scientific management is replace rule of thumb methods and methods based on scientific study of the task. So truly bring in experts who look at the task and break it down into very specific, scalable, and easily taught skills. Then scientifically select, train, and develop each worker rather than passively leaving them to train themselves. So create a training program that's very focused on this one skill. Cooperate the workers to ensure that the scientifically developed methods are being followed. Notice we're feeling theory X here. It requires a lot of oversight, a lot of management, and then divide the work nearly equally between managers and workers so the managers applying scientific management principles, watching, oversight, motivating, to plan the work, and workers are actually performing the task. Now, the downside to this, of course, is that if you were a barrel maker prior to scientific management, you probably had quite a few years of training. You probably had a lot of investment, and you were probably fairly proud that you were a barrel maker, that you had this set of skills. And at the end of each task, you could look at your product. I built this barrel. In scientific management, basically, you're nearly an unskilled worker doing a single task. I carve staves. That's all I do. I do that all day. I don't do anything else. And I don't even know what the staves are used for. I mean, I can see that barrel. I assume I've got a part of that, but there's a lot less ownership in it. So it is a way to greatly increase productivity, but it also relies very heavily on that theory X viewpoint of the world. So classical organizational theory added on to this. It basically talked about the division of labor, the practice of dividing labor into specialized tasks, and enable people to specialize in what they do best, utilizing much of what is learned in scientific management. So again, this is thinking about how do we actually set up an organization to take advantage of that scientific management? How do we actually start applying this to the workforce itself? So a large proponent of this was Max Weber, and it was an earlier approach to the study of management that focused on the most efficient way to structure organizations. So this is, again, in my opinion, a theory X theory, and it is not a it depends theory. There is one way to do it, and this is the way. And it works fairly well for large assembly line style scientific management organizations. So the idea behind classical organizational theory is really about how you set up an organization to maximize this process. And that is through a bureaucracy, an organizational design developed by Max Weber that attempts to make organizations operate as efficiently as possible by having a clear hierarchy of authority in which people are required to perform well-defined jobs. And if you think about where we started in the previous module talking about what is an organization, part of it was that it's structured, that there is some form of organizational design. Now, modern organizations require and actually use a lot of different organizational designs, but many of the larger ones still often are bureaucratic in design. They still kind of follow this. And we find bureaucracies much more commonly in larger organizations and larger production organizations. So the characteristics of an ideal bureaucracy are here on this slide. So basically, the characteristics include formal rules and regulations. So all organizations have some form of rules. but a bureaucracy will have very specific written guidelines for every behavioral control of every level of the organization. There's going to be a tendency towards impersonal treatment. There is a focus on making sure favoritism is not included and work relationships are based on objective standards. So that impersonal treatment is supposed to also get rid of some of this bias that we used to find in organizations. In other words, promotion should be based on performance and nothing else. Division of labor is going to be key. All duties are divided into specialized tasks and performed by individuals with appropriate skills. And we're going to circle back to this. This does result in optimal performance, but it does not necessarily result in satisfied and engaged employees. There's a very hierarchical structure here. Positions are ranked by authority and in a clear fashion from the very lowest level to the very top level. Everyone knows their role, everyone knows who they report to, everyone understands the system. And that includes an authority structure. The making of decisions is determined by one position in the hierarchy. Higher ranking people have authority over those in lower ranking. So there's not a lot of collaboration on decision making. And also within each level of the organization, it is very clearly defined what you can and cannot decide, and who's making the decisions. And usually there's going to be a central leader as well. There is a lifelong career commitment. Employees are viewed as permanent lifelong obligation on the part of the organization and its employees. So again, a bureaucracy is based on the idea that once you start working for it, you'll never leave. Now, again, if we look at modern organizations, we find this is it was common in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. This lifelong career commitment is becoming rarer and rarer in the modern workplace. And finally, there's a rationality. The organization is committed to achieving its ends, profitability, in the most efficient manner possible. Efficiency is key in classical organizational theory. What started to break us away from this theory X was actually originally a series of studies on human relations by Hawthorne. And these were called, or not by Hawthorne, these were the Hawthorne studies taking place at an electric plant, Hawthorne electric plant. They were actually conducted by Elton Mayo and his team, and Mayo inadvertently discovered there's something more beyond scientific management. So again, he came into these studies with the idea that really what we're looking for is optimal performance. And he was looking at assembly line study, but he wanted to manipulate various working conditions to find the optimal working conditions to have people conduct in an assembly line. But his results didn't make sense. And what they didn't make sense is every time he changed, whether it was, in his opinion, a positive or negative change, more lighting, less lighting, hotter, colder, any change resulted in an increase in productivity. Now, he was also immediately following the change with interacting with the workforce, asking them questions. And what he found was, and what he suggested was, it was the actual showing interest in their well being that was resulting in the increase in performance, not the changes that he was making in the scientific management structures. And of course, this created a, if you will, a firestorm of studies in applying psychology to the workplace. And it sounds to today's mind like a duh moment. Wow, people actually perform better if we treat them well. But this really was kind of a unique perspective because scientific management and classical organizational theory had been so successful at increasing profitability in the modern workforce that we had kind of lost track as a field that there's also this individual level, this theory Y kind of viewpoint of the world. And that's where we start to see theory Y become strong in the 50s and 60s and into today.